I close my eyes, only for a moment.
Hi, welcome to Whiteboarding 112, the Big Three Feedback Tools. During this session, I'm going to talk about the whiteboard look, the whiteboard pass, and the whiteboard walk. Three wonderful methods to allow for students to receive feedback before they revise their boards. Last time I also started a series on whiteboard mistakes that we commonly make, and the first one I talked about was mechanical boarding, which is where the teacher's going through the motions of whiteboarding, where students answer, hold up their boards, answer, hold up their boards. But it doesn't necessarily fit into the three higher philosophy, where with that element of interaction, you have students answer while the teacher plays a role and gives a feedback walk, and then there's a cycle of revision and feedback. And that fits very carefully into research-backed methods. Just using a whiteboard as a tool doesn't increase student achievement per se. You have to use it in a very specific way. The second whiteboarding mistake that people make I call dust boarding, where essentially you think of using whiteboards as an activity you use every once in a while, and then they sit in a corner and they collect dust. Teachers will simply use whiteboarding for review. They'll teach an entire unit, they won't have those visible methods in place during the unit, and then they'll have a review whiteboarding session before they give the assessment where they find out, hey, my students don't actually know what they need to know. Why? Because they weren't constantly seeing visibly what all students were thinking. So a lot of teachers will go and they'll buy some whiteboards or some markers, and they simply end up sitting in a corner. There are some definite reasons for this to happen, and the first one is habit. It's all about our brain and how our brain works. Habits are consistent behaviors that we take all the time, and we don't have to give a lot of effort towards them. For example, driving a car. When you first learned to drive a car, it was really effortful. It was very tiring. You had to know exactly what to do and think about every single little motion. But now, when you've been driving a car for a while, everything seems more effortless. Instead of utilizing the front of the brain and many structures of the brain, once the habit is formed, we only utilize an area called the basal ganglia, which is more of an effort-free region. It's simply a way of getting our bodies and brains to do habitual behaviors over and over again. And if you think in terms of evolution, what keeps us alive, if we had to think about every single behavior we did, we wouldn't have enough time to hunt for food or to try to stay alive when we're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger. And so what our brain has evolved to do is to ensure that we use habits as much as possible. Habits reduce the amount of effort that's required in behaviors. So if we think in terms of teaching, it's habitual in our behavior, in what we see in our head when we think of teachers, in our movements, in our words as teachers, to ask kids to raise their hand and respond. Why? Because we grew up with that. Because in the majority of classrooms, it was very traditional, where one student responded at a time, one student talked at a time. This became a habitual behavior for us. It's something that's built into our basal ganglia. It's effort-free in order to say, okay, raise your hand and respond. That's a lot different than the effort that's required to, let's say, do a timed pair share. If we had grown up in schools that only used, let's say, Kagan cooperative learning, or 3 higher whiteboarding, or whole brain teaching, those would be the habits ingrained in our brain. We would spend our whole life experiencing them, and that would be what feels comfortable in a classroom. And let's say we went to a foreign land and went into their school and they were all traditional. We would look around like, what is going on? And if we were forced to teach that way, we would feel the same way towards it. Our habits would take over and we would automatically start doing time pair shares rather than raise your hand. So it's all about habit formation. Our brain resists going beyond the habitual behaviors that have been built in through years of experience. Biologically, dust boarding must exist because it's really hard to change habits. It's difficult. And here's the crazy thing about the brain. So let's say you get in front of a classroom and you're used to having kids raise their hand and lecturing. And instead you decide to do some whole brain teaching, right? And you say class and they say yes, and you say mirror words, they say mirror words, and you start trying to do some mirror words. It's going to feel really clunky. It's going to feel really effortful, and your brain is going to start to send this message to your body going, hold on, this isn't normal, this isn't okay, right? And we feel that feeling like this just doesn't feel right, that awkward feeling. That is our basal ganglia signaling to the rest of our brain saying, hey, come on, this is way too much effort. I need to stop this. As a result, cortisol, the stress signal, is released. We feel the stress, and then we choose not to use that behavior again. Once the cortisol is released, you feel stress. And the brain has to come up with a reason. It has to come up with a story for why you don't want to do whole brain teaching. And there's a beautiful psychological principle called confabulation, where we think that our thoughts create our feelings, but a lot of the time it's the other way around. Our feelings create our thoughts. And so you feel uncomfortable, and your brain comes up with a nice reason for why you feel uncomfortable. It could be something like, oh, well, my kids weren't responding to it. Or, I was having a really bad day, I was feeling a little bit sick, and it just wasn't that right time. And so confabulation fills in the blank. We choose not to change our habits and behaviors because our basal ganglia releases that cortisol saying, hold on, this is not habitual behavior, this is not what I see in my head when it comes to teaching, this is new, lots of effort. The stress is there, and we confabulate and come up with reasons not to change. That's why it's extremely difficult to instructionally coach teachers into these new methods. It has to be slow, one thing at a time. And here's the most beautiful thing about it. And once you've been using these techniques for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, every time you use them, they become more of a habit. They become built into the brain. And now, and I personally, if I get in front of a classroom, I have a hard time going back to traditional. Traditional feels weird for me. Like the words raise your hand just don't come naturally to me anymore. If I'm not saying mirror words and teach okay, and I'm not using whiteboards, I feel really weird about it. And the principle of least effort makes me go back to the techniques that I know. I go back to cooperative learning through higher whiteboarding and whole brain teaching. So there's hope. We just have to help teachers get over that hurdle. And you have to help yourself get over that hurdle, that implementation hurdle. They call it an implementation dip, or there's other words for it. It's you try something for the first time, the cortisol is released, and you abandon it. Confabulate some reason not to do it, and our boards gather dust. So that's one reason why dust boarding happens. And that brings us to reason number 2 to have dust boards. And that is because you tried it out and you had misbehavior or refusal to do it. Because unfortunately, as teachers, behavior is in the foremost of our mind. When we judge other people in their classroom, we're usually just thinking about behavior. Some administrators will do this. They might go into 2 classrooms, and one classroom the kids are silently working on something, and in the other classroom there's a lot of noise going on. All that noise, there's a lot of productive noise, but about 20% of the conversations are not about learning. And so that teacher will be judged very harshly by an administrator, or possibly by their peers. Earlier I talked about the PLC culture and not judging people. Judgment and misbehavior tend to go hand in hand. And I don't necessarily think that that is other people's problems either. I think that internally is our battle as teachers. We think if there's misbehavior going on in a classroom that we must be horrible teachers, that that's a horrible thing. Here's how I want to challenge that mindset. Let's say I'm a traditional teacher, traditional classroom, and I have my students copy some words down, and then I talk at them, and I've used slant and I've got my methods, and I have them sitting like this, looking at me, leaning forward. I've got 35 to 40 students' eyes looking at me. And it's perfect. Everyone's silent, they're all staring at me. One student raises their hand, or I pull a popsicle stick and that student gets the answer right. Beautiful, moving on, right? Perfect classroom. Not at all. In that particular classroom, there's a lot of misbehavior going on. But here's the thing, it's invisible. We can't see it. When the teacher is talking, there's about 10 students that may be looking at the teacher, but they're only passively listening. They're thinking about other things. Now, there's no evidence that they're doing this, but in my book, this is misbehavior. They are not actively, passionately invested in what I'm saying. They're not visualizing anything I'm saying. They're not interacting with anything I'm saying. They are simply sitting there. Now, as a teacher, what I think misbehavior is going on in the room. And even as an administrator, you might walk in and say, oh, okay, yeah, there's no misbehavior. This is a perfect classroom. The students are silently and dutifully listening. They're even leaning forward. They're looking. And he cold called and they got the right answer. There is misbehavior in that room. It's just not detectable. And now let me take you into a non-traditional classroom. So in this particular moment, the teacher has students with whiteboards. And they're talking, that's going to be the element, and the interaction will be illustrative boarding. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and students are going to illustrate what I'm saying. And so now, the teacher's talking, students are trying to illustrate. But out of 40 students in the room, 10 of them are not illustrating at all. Think of the gross misbehavior going on now, right? What's the difference between the rooms? Is there a difference? And I'm going to challenge you and say there isn't. One of them simply had detectable misbehavior and the other one didn't. But here's the problem. The teacher in the first room thinks I'm wonderful, right? And the teacher in the second room thinks, wow, I've got 10 kids that aren't actively listening to me and invested in what I'm saying. So this teacher feels bad. They feel like they're not that great of a teacher, and this teacher feels great. We, for the first time, can visibly see the misbehavior going on. And because we can see it, we feel like, oh, the misbehavior wasn't there before, but it's there now. And so now I'm going to abandon these methods, go back to my traditional. Traditional is where I feel more comfortable anyways, and look at the misbehavior this brought into my classroom. Let me take a second to talk about cooperative learning. Kagan, absolute brilliant system, right? If you haven't listened to me, go get a Kagan book. Get that first cooperative learning book. Go read it. Go study it. But here's why people tend to abandon it. They feel that cooperative learning brings in misbehavior. So let's go back to that classroom, right? And the teacher is reading a story out loud, okay? And students are supposed to be actively listening. In the traditional classroom, 10 students aren't actively listening. They're not following along in their books. They're staring at their book just to pretend so they can get away with it. And then in the cooperative learning classroom, the teacher says, okay, you're going to rally robin things you learned about the character in this section. In the cooperative learning classroom, students start rally robin back and forth. But 10 students aren't able to do that because they weren't actively listening. And so now in this cooperative learning classroom, those 10 students have visible misbehavior. We can actually see that they misbehaved. They weren't actively listening. Go back to the traditional classroom. Invisible misbehavior. You can't see it. And so once again, an administrator's in the room and they see this cooperative learning going on. 10 kids not talking. This cooperative learning thing is horrible. Look at all the misbehavior it creates. They go into a traditional classroom. Oh, look at all these students looking at the book, and the teacher cold called this student over here and they knew the right answer. Beautiful, no misbehavior. Once you see it this way, it's really hard to go back. Invisible misbehavior is destroying our classrooms. You can't see it, it's still there. If you have whole brain teaching in place, cooperative learning in place, and 3-hour whiteboarding in place, it's really hard to misbehave. You have to actively be engaged. And if you're not, it's visible for the teacher to see, and now the teacher can do something about it. So you couldn't do anything about it in the traditional classroom because you didn't even know it was there. You felt good, you thought students were listening, but here's what always happens. In the traditional classroom, they'll come to the test, the students will fail it, and the teacher will say, man, I thought they knew it. No. They sat passively. It looked like they were behaving, but they weren't actively engaged. When you're in a totally visible classroom and students are whiteboarding, the misbehavior is there. It's in your face. You can do something about it. That brings me to the second part of this, refusal. Will there be students that refuse to board? Yes, there will. There will be students that refuse to cooperatively learn. There will be students that refuse your whole brain teaching. There will be students that refuse writing anything on a whiteboard. It will happen. It happens to me. But I got a question for you. Let's say it's one student, right? Let's just say it's one student. 1 or 2. In a traditional classroom, would that student have been misbehaving anyways? Let's say you were talking, right? And they were sitting there. Was that student actively listening to you anyways? The answer is most likely no. So now let's say you're having them have to draw something or write something on a whiteboard. They're not doing it. Are they misbehaving? Yes. It's visible now. You can see it. It's in your face. But you feel better about it, right? In the traditional classroom because you couldn't see it, so you don't have to feel bad that they're not actively engaged. And what really sucks is for the sake of the feeling of the teacher, we use these traditional methods, and the 90% of the class that could have been using those effective, wonderful methods and be fully engaged, they now suffer because you put those whiteboards in the corner because it made the 10 students that weren't misbehaving before but actually were. It makes their misbehavior visible. And that's how we end up with dust boards due to misbehavior. Use these methods. You're not creating misbehavior in your classroom. You're simply finally seeing it for the first time for what it is. In a session later on, I'm going to talk more about those students that refuse to whiteboard. I call them reluctant boarders, and I've got tons of tips and strategies to help with them. And finally, reason number 3, dustboarding, is the idea that there's not enough time to do this. Think about a traditional classroom. You're talking at kids. How much are they really learning? How much do you have proof that they're really learning? But if I introduce some of these tips and strategies, instead of one student raising their hand, one at a time, imagine if you wanted to find out what every single student in the classroom thought about a question, and you spent 30 seconds with each. Think of all the time that wastes. Versus, I'm seeing right now what all students are thinking about the question. Think about how much time that saves. You suddenly know where the misconceptions are, right? That saves time in the long run. And does it take some time to introduce management procedures, right? Like how to use the supplies, open boarding, closed boarding? Does it take some time to teach illustrative boarding and how to get students to be able to do these tools and strategies? Yes, of course it does. But that time pays dividends in the future. Because instead of just having to guess which students are actively engaged and which ones aren't, and where the misconceptions are, who's learning, who's not, you get to see it all the time. So in the long run, these techniques save time. Okay, on to the professional toolbox and our big 3 feedback tools, the whiteboard look, whiteboard walk, and the whiteboard pass. So I've talked about all 3 of these tools in the past, and so they shouldn't really be mysteries to you, but we'll go a little bit more in depth in what they are and what they're not. So the first one is a whiteboard look. So you give students an element in interaction, they answer on their board, and then you want students to revise their board. And so you'll give them the revision. Okay, you're going to add this to your board, you're going to take this away, you're going to change, you're going to do something. And then you say whiteboard look. Okay, students hold it up. Then they look around. You make sure you have students pivot, teach them how to do that, make sure that they're looking around and seeing things. And then you very clearly give them the direction to, okay, revise your board, go. So students have seen the boards, they've seen some of their peers, and they've put it down. Now keep in mind, you can also have teacher feedback on this one. If you used a teacher board, your teacher board could be one that's held up as well, right? So students could also be looking at the things that you've decided to put in there. And so that's a whiteboard look at its simplest. A whiteboard pass is simply a variation on getting kids to look at other kids' whiteboards. You might say, okay, whiteboard pass to the left, and students take their whiteboards, they pass them to the person to the left. Okay, whiteboard pass to the left, go. Whiteboard pass to the left, go. There's many different variations of how you could have whiteboards passed. You kind of get to set where the whiteboards get passed to. But it's good to have a consistent flow of where whiteboards get passed to so you don't have to constantly be explaining to students which direction to pass them. When students are passing the whiteboard around, they should have something very specific to look for. So let's say it's illustrative boarding. Okay, take a look at their illustration. Think of some things you could add to your board. Or, how is it the same? How is it different? The fun part about it is if you're doing double boarding, which is an all-star tool I'll talk about later, they keep another whiteboard at their table, and when they get their peers' whiteboard, you could have them take some notes. So notes on a T-chart on the feedback board were same, different, and then they have to write down things that are the same, things that are different. But if you're going to do whiteboard passes, make sure students have their name on their board so that they can get their board back in the end if that is what you intend. Now you could simply have students pass their boards around, getting feedback for, let's say, how to solve a math problem. And then the revision is a totally new math problem. So now they've passed their board 5 times, they've seen what 5 of their students have done, have them erase that board and give them a new problem that uses exactly the same skills. And so their revision becomes simply a new element interaction. And so that way students don't have to necessarily give their boards back. But if students are doing illustrations, you might want them to have their board back, so if the name's on it, you give them a count to 5. Okay, 5 seconds to have your original board, everyone. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and they should have their original boards. Some of my favorite variations of whiteboard passes are I'll have students start an answer, pause them, and have them do a whiteboard pass. So they're kind of getting immediate feedback partway through their answer, right? And then you pause them, stop them, have them pass it again, and then they continue the answer on. So it sort of becomes a whole class response. That one response doesn't necessarily belong to one student, but to many students. And so it's a great way to give instantaneous feedback before students have actually finished. Now, keep in mind the differences between the two. With a whiteboard look, students definitely get to decide how many whiteboards they look at and what information they get from. But they're able to look at more whiteboards at once. With a whiteboard pass, it's very specific to the partner whiteboards that they get. And so if you only do one pass, they've really only looked at one board for feedback. So you want to do multiple passes You could couple these together, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be separate, but they're just two different unique ways to get whole class feedback. And the last big three feedback tool is the whiteboard walk. It is my favorite. It kind of goes along with some Kagan research in terms of getting kids standing up and walking around to get some more blood flowing. And when you get students up and walking around, they kind of get to move at their own pace now and really see other students' boards up front. But please remember, you have to give the revision first. Students shouldn't just be standing up and walking around for no reason. And they have to know that when they go back to their seat, they're going to revise their board in some way based upon this whiteboard walk. And the great thing about this one is that it's naturally differentiated. When students are walking around, they go at their own pace. However, you do really need to manage this really well. And there's many different variations of this you could do. I saw one teacher in a second grade classroom had them not get to choose where they walked around, but the tables moved. So table 1, all the students moved to table 2. Then they moved to table 3, then to 4. So it was a very organized type of whiteboard walk. But the idea is students get up, they walk around, and they see what others have put on their boards, and then they go back and revise. This is actually my favorite to do because I can also introduce a teacher board. So my teacher board is in a select location where students know they can go look at my board first, or they can look at my board last, and they also get to see their peers as well while they're up and moving around. So big three feedback tools, they all have their different feels to them, but it's great. It gives a lot of variety, not having to just do one in the same way. As usual, I want to show you what I mean in a whiteboard cycle. And I decided this time to go more for the professional development capacity, because this is really what I think about all the time now. I'm not necessarily teaching kids anymore. I have sessions where I'm working with adults. And so I use these strategies with adults. And we start with the element in interaction, and the element is a problem or scenario in this case. A group of teachers were presented with a case study on a difficult, unmotivated student named Joe. Okay, then they're given an interaction. What are some concrete teacher actions you can take to motivate Joe? Okay, so they have open boarding and they start to write down as many things that they can do to help Joe, the reluctant student. While that's happening, I'm going to do a positivity walk. I'm going to walk around and I'm going to privately give teachers some positive praise for the things they're writing down. So now here comes the feedback. And in this case, I'm going to do a whiteboard pass. So now they're going to pass their board around until the music stops. So they might pass 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, reading their peer responses, passing around to each other to get that peer feedback. Before I have them do a whiteboard pass, I'm going to give them the revision, and I'm going to say, okay, when I stop the music, you're actually going to erase the answer, whatever board's in front of you, and you're going to respond again. But you're not allowed to put the same exact thing as before. So this is one of those things where they're going to answer again in a different way. So I start the music, they pass the boards around, play the music for a while, they're looking at different things they could do to help with Joe. Stop the music, erase your boards, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, go ahead and answer again. And while they're doing that, I've added some more positivity walks. So I'm gonna walk around and once again see great things teachers are putting down. So now this is one of my favorite things to do. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pick two boards that are very different from each other. Because I'm walking around, I'm looking and I'm seeing what responses have been, and I'm sure there's going to be one response that's very different from another one. So I'm going to grab those responses from the teachers, I'm going to say thank you so much. I'm going to go to the front of the room and I'm going to say, okay, here's this response, here's this response. Now here's your interaction. Which one do you agree with more and why? I'm going to give them the whiteboard stem. I agree more with blank because of blank. So it's a fun way to continue my whiteboard interaction and get them to think at sort of a higher level and give some reasoning behind it. Now notice this time I'm doing closed boarding. I don't want teachers to see the opinions of other teachers. I want them to really think for themselves and come up with very unique reasons. However, I personally am going to walk around and I'm going to look for some trends. Here are some things that people are saying, some reasons they're giving, and I'm going to go ahead and shout those out. So they've had some time to respond, and now I'm going to go to my feedback and revision. And I'm actually going to do a very unique combination of a whiteboard look and a whiteboard walk. So I'm going to actually do 2 rounds of feedback. So for the first one, I'm going to do a whiteboard look. I'm going to tell teachers, okay, you're going to add 2 more reasons to your sentence. So instead of saying I chose board 1 because blah, you're going to say I chose board 1 because of blah and blah. So they hold it up. They have to find someone that agreed with them and see the reason so they can add another one. Now I'm going to go to the next one. We're going to do a whiteboard walk. Okay, so now they're going to get up and they're going to walk around. But I'm going to give them their revision. Here's your revision. When you come back to your seat, you're going to erase your original answer and you now have to disagree with yourself. You are now going to think the other board that you didn't choose is the best. And I want you to give a couple reasons for that. And so you need to walk around and see what other people have put. Whiteboard walk, teachers walk around, they look for the different answer, come back and they revise their boards. So you kind of see how I've strung together a whiteboard pass, a whiteboard look, and a whiteboard walk to facilitate a great, nice round of teachers sharing ideas for how to deal with reluctant students, thinking of reasons for those ideas, and learning together in a very visible way. The most beautiful thing as an instructor at the end of this is I've now visibly seen what a lot of my staff have come up with. Even though I didn't put picture boarding on there, I think what I would probably do is I would take some pictures of some boards. Okay, that's the 3 big feedback tools and a little bit about dustboarding. I hope you got something from this. Please feel free to comment below. I'm always excited to read questions or comments that you have. Or feel free to email me if you would like me to send you my whiteboard toolbox. I hope you have an excellent week back at school, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.